Friends, our program, I'm Iouri Loutsenko, you know who I am. Our program is becoming more and more interesting. Last podcast we recorded in the Central Park after our lecture on the topic, right? Of kicking Russia out of the UN. Well, today we are, I would say, in much more interesting place. Because today we are in the Loutsenko Center for International Law, which was founded by practically one of the founders of the entire concept of international law. And guess what? He was a graduate of the university. And we're in the old library, and I am super, super excited to introduce Thomas Grant, a professor of University of Cambridge and a fellow of the Loutsenko Center for International Law. And the story is interesting, in fact, because when our team, Civica team, Maxim Bareshnikov and our entire team started to work on this issue of Russia's illegal presence in the UN, then all of a sudden we discover that there is someone who is absolutely like-minded. And I'm extremely, extremely pleased that Professor Thomas Grant, who is a well-known specialist in the area, is sharing our views. We're now sort of working as one team, so to say. And let me probably start with the fact that it's truly amazing that we are going along the same line of argument. Our team and you're absolutely independently from each other. We're going along the same line of argument. So I guess the first, and we agree on basic things, right? Number one, we call it fraud, but we're an NGO, you're a professor, so you call it very irregular. Very irregular way how Russia ended up in the United Nations. And then, obviously, we both recognize that it's a major injustice, and we're looking for ways how to deal with it. So I would very much appreciate you remember we spoke about sort of three levels and three ways. I'll be interrupting you, but basically, we would love to hear your thoughts on two things. Number one, the irregularity, and number two, the way how to deal with that. And by the way, just as a way of introduction, I cannot name names yet, but this is new for you. We just found out. We have sort of a silent member of our team who is a staffer at the UN. And literally yesterday, he was approached by the team of one of the major powers, saying that yes, they're ready to hear our arguments, and we're ready to proceed towards a South African case.
That's very good news, Professor Loutsenko. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And you mentioned the South African case, and for people joining us who might not have read the international law history or the history of the United Nations in that much depth, the United Nations, on a couple of occasions in the past, has taken a very improvisatory approach when it has been presented with a member whose presence in the organization is in some serious respect anomalous or irregular. And probably the most famous, or the more famous of the two major examples, was South Africa, as you just mentioned. The early 1970s.
Chinese case.
And the other is the Chinese case. In both cases, the General Assembly referred to its procedures on credentialing representatives. Those are the procedures intended simply to affirm that a given person is the proper representative of the state who he or she says he's representing. In the case of South Africa, a long time had gone on where member states were telling South Africa it had to end apartheid. Apartheid should never have started, and it certainly shouldn't have continued as long as it did. Finally, the United Nations determined under its credentials procedures, South Africa would no longer be allowed to speak on the floor of the Assembly. So the Assembly, the General Assembly of the UN, suspended South Africa's privileges to appear as a member in the organization. Now, there's not really any clear roadmap in the UN Charter or the UN General Assembly procedural rules to explain how that worked. But the General Assembly did it, and
it's
with
a
good cause.
precedent.
With
And
good
it's a
cause.
precedent.
And it's a precedent for this sort of what I would call a very improvised approach when the merits of the case justify doing it. So when we ask ourselves, what are the merits? When I talk about merits in this setting, we're talking about the general international law framework that binds all states, prohibits aggression, prohibits the use of force to change borders, prohibits forcible annexation of territory, and certainly prohibits the gross violations of humanitarian law that the Russian Federation has committed against Ukraine these last months, and really years going back to 2014. So at that, what we might think of as sort of the highest level of public international law, the merits are perfectly clear to anybody who looks at them with open eyes and an open mind. Russia has committed extraordinary violations of some of the most fundamental rules of international law. Now, UN said at the outset that it would open its doors to countries that are peace-loving and that are ready to abide by the principles of the UN Charter. UN has provision for expelling a member that fails to abide by the principles of the Charter and consistently violates the principles. Now, problem is the expulsion procedure requires that the Security Council recommend expulsion.
Obviously.
It's very hard to get a vote of the Security Council if you're trying to expel Russia, which wields a veto in the Council. So that procedure is probably not your direct pathway to doing something.
Yeah, but we'll come back to the three levels, sort of say. But
Yes, yeah.
as we discussed before, we see our objective is to lay ground for the basic level, to say that Russia is not really a member of the United Nations because of the irregularities, as you put it, or fraud, as we put it, of December 1991. So, you see, our premise is, and we spoke about it, I think you would agree, that our premise is that there was never a properly done procedure of admitting Russia to the United Nations because, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was dissolved, right? So, unlike many other cases, obviously our opponents would talk about India, Pakistan, whatever, not applicable. Because in this particular case, the original founding members were the USSR, Soviet Union, Ukrainian SSR, and Belarusian SSR. And in a very, very weird way, it's a Stalin's gift to modern Ukraine. But Russian Federation has invented this non-existent concept of état continuité, which is really because the successor states of the Soviet Union are all 15 republics, former republics. But they invented this thing of continuator state, and we keep arguing that from a point of view of UN Charter, it was basically two pieces of paper, two meaningless pieces of paper, Yeltsin's letter and so-called Almaty papers, which we're also questioning now, that has become a ground for Russia's presence in the UN. So we see our role in sort of laying the entire map of legal base to explain that Russia was never a proper member of the UN.
You mentioned the theory of state continuity. The idea is that when a country exists, it continues to exist. Very simple proposition. We assume that every country within its recognized borders continues its legal identity as an international law actor. But we also recognize that under certain circumstances where you have radical changes in the territorial configuration of a state,
Which was the case.
the internal constitutional configuration of a state,
Exactly.
and the international relations of a state, where the change is really a rupture. It's not the sort of change that you simply experience in the ordinary day-to-day transactions within a state and in its international relations, but instead it's a real breaking point in those relations. When that happens, the state that was and the state that has come to be, and its partners, especially its partners who have emerged as newly independent states from its territory, have a lot of business that they need to settle with one another. It happens whenever you have this sort of very radical rupture in legal relations, and the way that states have come to deal with that sort of change is that they negotiate a solution. Now, Russia appeared quite suddenly in December 1991 in the seat that heretofore had been called the USSR seat. The nameplates were changed from USSR
Simple,
to Russian Federation.
Simple nameplate. And done, by the way, done on Christmas night, December 24, 1991.
When nobody was watching.
Yeah.
What's more important than the simple physical act, though, is to look behind it and see what transactions Russia undertook with its partners when that happened and after that happened. If you look at the full picture of the legal relationships, what you see is that Russia entered into a type of bargain, and a lot of countries accepted the bargain actively, and the rest really just had nothing to say about it, which is a sort of tacit acceptance. Part of the bargain involved Russia taking the UN seat. Russia got a lot of other things too. It got the Cosmodrome at Baikonur, got much of the Soviet Navy, all of the Soviet nuclear weapons arsenal, strategic and tactical, much of the Soviet conventional military arsenal, Soviet advanced listening bases like the one in Armenia, Soviet financial assets, Soviet embassy and foreign properties, plus the Russian...
By the way, Ukraine never agreed, you know, that Ukraine never ratified the CIS, and Ukraine never agreed to this very, very uneven
the
and
distribution.
Distribution, because Ukraine kept saying that, okay, guys, we are also a successor state of the USSR, so Ukraine is entitled to 16% of all USSR's assets. It never happened. But nevertheless, let's come back to our sort of three levels, right?
Yes.
So our team, with your help, is laying the basic level. But let's talk about all three.
Yes. Well, we've already mentioned what you might think of as the public international law level, where Russia has committed gross violations of the most fundamental rules and principles of international law. It's at that level that we find a good justification for taking action, similar to the action that the General Assembly took when South Africa insisted on continuing to violate fundamental rules by continuing the apartheid system. So at that level, the merits of the case for either removing Russia outright or at least suspending its participation, the merits are very strong.
Absolutely.
Now, the question is, do we have, at the level of a procedure, a rule or a mechanism in the UN that opens the door to do that? Think of that as the sort of lowest level, the procedural operationalization of this step that we're talking about, either removing or suspending Russia. How do you actually do it as a matter of United Nations procedure? That's, in a way, the lowest, I call it the operational level.
Yes.
But in between the public international law level, where I think we have a widespread consensus that there is good merit to the case for taking action against Russia as a participant in the UN, either suspending or removing Russia from the UN. And then the lowest level presents the puzzle, what procedures do we use? I think there are two possible answers to that procedural question. First, there is the established record of the UN the precedent of being very improvisatory when it needs to do that. It did it with South Africa, even though there is no set script
Absolutely.
in the charter telling them how to do it. They also did it to change the seat of China. China's seat till the early 70s was held by the government in Taipei, Taiwan. But then the assembly decided to switch that seat to Beijing, the People's Republic of China. Now, the thing is, it wasn't a straightforward case where you had competing governments, one of which really had no purchase or foothold of any real kind. You have situations like the Maduro regime and the Guaidó regime, the two competing governments in Venezuela. One actually has power, though, the other doesn't.
Yeah.
That's a slightly different case than China. In China, there were two, and still are, two different territorial authorities with undoubted effective day-to-day government and control over their territory. So switching from Taiwan to China was actually a radical step at the time. And again, the step was taken really by making it up as they went along. The General Assembly found the way to do it. So that's one answer to the procedural puzzle, that lowest level legal puzzle. What are the procedures we use? But there's a second procedural avenue. If we focus on the Security Council, where Russia holds the veto and is a permanent member by virtue of filling the USSR seat, which remains a USSR seat, according to the Charter, the Security Council has its own rules of procedure. And under Rule 17 of the Security Council Rules of Procedure, an objection may be made to the credentials of a member. If one member of the Council objects to the credentials presented supposedly by another member, then an objection can be lodged. If an objection is lodged, the Council then must decide the matter. That's a straightforward procedural mechanism written in black letter and practically never used. But given the ability, the proven ability of the UN organization to improvise, to deal with anomalous situations of this kind, one could imagine an objection being put forward against the credentials of the Russian Federation to fill the Soviet seat. Now, it would then come down to a procedural vote, and that's the procedural aspect that makes this an interesting avenue to investigate. The Council votes on substantive matters with the veto. In other words, to pass a substantive resolution, you need to avoid the veto of any of the 5 permanent members. But procedural matters are not subject to veto.
Absolutely.
And it is a procedural question when a member objects to another person's credentials on the Council. Under the procedural rules, you need simply 9 affirmative votes, and the veto doesn't count. There is no veto.
So there is no veto, right?
Yep.
Wow.
Now, again, this is calling on the Council to do something very bold, highly improvisatory, and there is, of course, a conservative ethos in any legal office, in any foreign ministry, a very conservative ethos in the Secretariat
Believe me,
of the
we
UN.
have personal experience with that.
And that's the job of lawyers. That's their job. They don't mean any ill will.
No.
But if the political impetus existed and you secured the 9 required votes, it would be an interesting, let's say it would be an interesting problem for the Russian delegate. And 9 votes is a lot in a body with only 15 members. However, keep in mind that the Council has had strong 12-member majorities in favor of Ukraine since February 24th.
Yeah.
And so you could imagine a situation where 2 or 3 are lost, so to speak, but you'd still have your 9. That's why I think at that procedural level, there are at least these 2 interesting options, one at the General Assembly level, one at the Security Council level. We would then also have to think about what, when we were talking earlier the other day, we were thinking of as the intermediate level. And that is the question of the UN's own law, not the procedural law of the UN, but the actual operation, the law of the organization writ large, we have to deal with the fact that for over 30 years, a Russian Federation diplomat has filled the Soviet seat.
Right, and I think again, we discussed it before, and in your opinion, it would be a difficult challenge. Nevertheless, I mean, the same Chinese case, because even the common logic says, okay, so if you are now removing Russia, then you are sort of at least questioning all the decisions of the Security Council over the period of 31 years. But again, Chinese case is to help us, because nobody ever questions the decisions of the Security Council from 1949 to 1971, when from 49 to 71, the Chinese seat at the Security Council was filled by the government that was not controlling the vast majority of Chinese territory. So.
That's right. That's right. In other words, the organization has improvised and found a way around these problems. I think that another point to be made at this, thinking of this again as an intermediate level between the very detailed nitty-gritty procedure on the one hand and public international law on the other hand, there's this intermediate range of argument that it would be helpful to think about when talking to interlocutors at the UN. And if we look back to December 1991, where the really historic events leading to the fall of the Soviet Union came to a head. You'd had this period of glasnost and perestroika, and then an unraveling of the Soviet constitution, disappearance of their constitution, disappearance of the Soviet Union as a state, which the members, both at Alma-Ata and Minsk, they affirmed there was no more Soviet Union. They actually said it's not just a political change, it's a legal change.
It's a legal change, and the Minsk Declaration was very clear that the Soviet Union as geopolitical, and I think I'm quoting correctly, as geopolitical entity and legal person ceased to exist.
Indeed. So if the entity ceased to exist, like Yugoslavia ceased to exist, like Czechoslovakia ceased to exist, then the question arises, how do you dispose of the assets, rights, and privileges of the countries that came out of this major rupture, this constitutional and legal change? And the answer, I think, that is worth considering is that it was a negotiated outcome in which Russia got a lot of assets and privileges, including the permanent member seat. In return, like in any bargain, there's two sides. There's an exchange of promises and assets. Russia, well, what did Russia give in return? Actually, not very much. It pledged to respect the boundaries of the former Soviet republics. It accepted that those boundaries, as of December 1991, were international boundaries, final and settled. It disclaimed any dispute against any of the other former Soviet republics. Now, that didn't cost money. It didn't involve the change of physical assets, but it was a very important undertaking by Russia. How important? Well, look at Yugoslavia and what happened there, where you did not obtain that sort of commitment right away. Very bad situation in the early to mid-90s in Yugoslavia. In Russia and in the neighboring countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, we avoided that through the 90s. Largely,
we avoided that through the 90s to sort of erupt now.
And then it erupts now, precisely.
Well, not now. Actually, I would say there were several sort of waves of eruption. One is illegal occupation by Russia, part of Moldova, because so-called PMR is really Russian-occupied territory. Then obviously Georgia and Ukraine.
And certainly at this point, with the scope and the persistence of Russia's violations of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, not to mention the other countries, Georgia, 2008, Moldova, even earlier. With these violations, a case is to be made that the legal grounding for Russia's takeover of the Soviet seat is gone. A deal was reached, and Russia got a lot out of the deal. All it promised
in fact,
in return.
let me interrupt you. In fact, we're not, you see, we're absolutely purposely, we call it Almaty Papers, not Almaty Declaration.
Yes, yeah.
And the reason we call it Almaty Papers, because really, it was a group of people, half of which were never elected by anybody. It just was a bunch of former first secretaries of the Communist Party of the respective Soviet republics. And like Georgia, for instance, never even signed it, and they tried to invoke this case in 2008. Ukrainian President Kravchuk has signed it, but then again, we can argue that Ukraine has never ratified it. So we're even questioning, the reason we call it Almaty Papers is because we're even questioning whether, from a purely legal point of view, whether the people who even signed this declaration, they had, A, whether they represented anybody, and B, whether they had purely legal powers to make such a deal. That's even before your argument that Russia broke a deal, you know?
But certainly an anomalous circumstance. You have the radical breakdown of one of the permanent members of the council. And just nobody in 1945 thought that was going to happen. In fact, in 1985, almost nobody thought that was going to happen. But 1991, there, it happened. And it raises serious questions about how the transition was executed. The difficulty with the Soviet seat at the UN is that with a public international law privilege like that, countries will place a great deal of weight on what it is that they actually saw happen over a period of time and what they actually acquiesced in happening. Therefore, even if we have difficulty in pinpointing a specific paper or contract or agreement whereby Russia took the Soviet seat, even if we have difficulty.
It doesn't exist.
The response that the Secretariat of the UN will give, and probably most of the foreign ministries of member states will give, the answer they will give is, yes, maybe, but even if you're right, Professor Loutsenko, they were there 30 years, and for 30 years we sat with them, we voted with them. Sometimes we voted against them, sometimes they voted against us, but we never made anything like an official complaint about them being there. And if you look at how international courts and tribunals deal with this sort of problem, not that this problem could ever go to court, there's no jurisdiction,
No.
or very unlikely to be jurisdiction. The way the courts, especially the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the way the judges would look at it is to say, maybe you have an interesting case that it was totally irregular and there was never any agreement, but we will interpret the actual practice of the countries over 30 years to have been equivalent to an agreement, a tacit agreement. And it's through this tacit acceptance that the Russian government now holds the Soviet seat that we will see this as regularized. It's a general tendency to try to regularize those sorts of relationships, if at all possible. That's why, in my estimation, looking at the circumstances, in that long 30-year period where we all just sat there as the Russians sat there, the potentially convincing argument to help push some of the members in the council to come to our position, to come to our view, to take action against Russia. The possibly convincing argument is to say, look, yes, but the agreement, whether it was written or tacit, has been
Broken.
vitiated, broken, completely broken
Completely
by
broken.
the Russian aggression against Ukraine.
And Georgia before, and Moldova before.
Which also, I think, is a very important part of the factual record to bring to people's attention, to make them remember. It's not just out of the blue. This didn't start on February 24th, 2022.
No.
So
it's an attitude, it's an approach, it's a Russian policy to deal. I mean, it's obvious now. It's just now it has come to such a vicious, huge, monstrous, genocidal size or whatever proportion.
Absolutely.
But it's always been their way to do things, you know. So anyway,
like we said before, the League of Nations threw them out after the invasion of Finland.
Wonderful. I think it was a very, very interesting exchange. And bottom line is, if we're working in this direction, if I correctly understand, step number one that can and should be done, like literally now, is working through the credentials committee. And then second step is to go along with this argument that there were major irregularities of how they obtained these seats by basically changing nameplates. And then all the promises within this negotiated settlement that they made, they were broken.
And that's really critical. I think it's important people understand that.
And that's a key argument to convince sort of the unconvinced.
I think it's a way to help. I think you have to make all your arguments, all your plausible arguments, and you start with the very important point that Russia has violated international law in a manner that's so extreme and really unprecedented that an organization dedicated to peace and security just can't tolerate a country doing that on this scale with this persistence for so long without taking some serious action beyond just a little bit of hand waving. It has to go beyond just hand waving.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Laurie, it's very good to spend time with Professor Loutsenko.
Thank you very much, Professor Grant. And I think it was a marvelous conversation in a marvelous setting.
Well, thank you for coming up to Cambridge.
Thank you.